You and your little pretend job playing dress-up with computers. That's what my father said to me at the Denver airport, not even looking up from his phone. Not hello, not how was your flight from Ramstein, not I've missed you these past 3 years. Just mockery wrapped in a chuckle, like my entire career was some elaborate game of make-believe that had gone on too long. I'm Audrey Moore. I'm 35 years old, and according to my father, retired Colonel James Moore, I've been playing soldier for the last 13 years. He called it my computer thing when he bothered to acknowledge it at all. To him, real military service meant mud on your boots and enemy fire over your head. Everything else was just expensive babysitting for machines that did the actual work. And me? I was the overpaid babysitter with a uniform I didn't deserve. We were standing there in the baggage claim, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, while families reunited around us with hugs and tears. But there was no warmth in his handshake, no pride in his eyes when he sized up my dress blues. Just that familiar look of disappointment, like I was still the daughter who'd chosen the wrong path and refused to admit it. "Your mother's excited you're back for my birthday," he said, adjusting his VFW cap. "Whole family's coming. Try not to bore everyone with your war stories about fighting keyboards." The thing is, I'd stopped trying to explain years ago. Stopped trying to tell him about the nights I'd spent in secured bunkers, fingers flying across multiple screens while incoming alerts lit up like Christmas trees. Stopped mentioning the times I'd prevented what could have been catastrophic breaches of NATO defense systems. Stopped talking about the decorations that came with citations he never bothered to read. Because to Colonel James Moore, if it didn't involve carrying a rifle through hostile territory, it wasn't really war. And if it wasn't really war, then I wasn't really a soldier. I was just his daughter playing an expensive game of pretend. The drive through Colorado Springs was tense. Same mountains, same view of Cheyenne Mountain in the distance, same radio stations playing classic rock. He talked about my brother Derek's construction business like it was a Fortune 500 company, about my sister Rachel's teaching career like she was reshaping America's youth. But when the conversation drifted toward me, toward what I'd been doing overseas, he changed the subject faster than channel surfing. "So, this cyber stuff, that's like IT support for the military, right? Fixing computers when they break?" I gripped my duffel bag tighter. "Something like that, Dad." The house looked exactly the same. American flag on the porch, perfectly manicured lawn, the kind of suburban perfection that screamed military precision. Inside, Mom was waiting with her warm smile and arms that actually wanted to hold me. She'd set the dining room table with her good china, the kind reserved for special occasions and distinguished guests. "Tell me everything," she said, squeezing my hands. "I want to hear about Germany, about your work, about everything." But before I could answer, Dad's voice cut through from the kitchen. "She pushes buttons on computers, Margaret, not exactly Normandy Beach." That's when I saw it, the shadow that crossed Mom's face. The same look she'd worn for years, when Dad's dismissiveness turned sharp. She knew what I really did. She'd kept every news article, every commendation letter that mentioned cyber warfare and national security. But she also learned not to correct him in front of company. "Well, I'm proud of you regardless," she said quietly. The birthday party was set for Saturday, 3 days away. 3 days of listening to Dad hold court with his old army buddies, swapping stories about real combat, while I sat silent at the kids' table of military service. 3 days of watching him puff up in pride when neighbors asked about Derek's latest construction project, while I became invisible the moment someone asked what I did for a living. But here's what Dad didn't know. Here's what none of them knew. While he was polishing his silver star from Desert Storm and telling anyone who'd listen about the good old days when soldiers were soldiers, I'd been quietly building something that would make his war stories sound like playground disputes. For the past 18 months, I'd been leading the joint task force that created the defensive protocols now protecting every major military installation in the European theater. My team had identified and neutralized 17 separate cyber intrusion attempts from hostile nations. We'd prevented what intelligence analysts later classified as potentially the largest coordinated attack on Western military infrastructure since World War II. The kind of attack that could have crippled communications, disabled defense systems, and left entire regions vulnerable to conventional assault. But that wasn't the kind of story that played well at VFW barbecues. There were no dramatic helicopter rescues, no heroic charges across enemy lines. Just me, hunched over screens in underground bunkers, watching code scroll past while the fate of thousands of soldiers like the ones Dad respected, hung in the balance of my decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every real soldier Dad admired, every grunt with mud on their boots and glory in their eyes, depended on systems I'd helped design and protect. Their communications, their logistics, their very ability to coordinate with allied forces, it all flowed through networks that people like me kept secure. But Dad would never see it that way. To him, heroism looked like his old unit photos. Men with rifles, standing in front of tanks, squinting against desert sun. It didn't look like his daughter in a climate-controlled command center preventing wars he'd never hear about. So I'd learned to smile and nod when he introduced me as the one who works with computers. I'd learned to let him believe that 13 years of service, 3 combat zone deployments, and a wall of commendations were just elaborate participation trophies for showing up. What he didn't know, what he was about to learn, was that respect isn't something you inherit from the family name. It's something you earn. And sometimes, the people you've been protecting recognize that value even when your own father can't see it. Saturday was going to be interesting. Because while Dad was expecting his usual crowd of retired enlisted men and local veterans to pat him on the back and reminisce about the glory days, I'd received some unexpected RSVPs to his party. Phone calls from very important people who wanted to pay their respects to the family of someone who'd been keeping them all safe. 3 phone calls, to be exact, from 3 people whose opinions carried considerably more weight than a retired colonel's wounded pride. If you've ever been called a dreamer, if you've ever been told your work doesn't matter, if you've ever watched someone take credit for the foundation you built in silence, stay with me. Because this isn't just about a father who couldn't see his daughter's worth. This is about what happens when the people who really matter finally show up to set the record straight. Let me tell you who I really am versus who my father thinks I am. Because the gap between those two realities could fill the Grand Canyon. To Colonel James Moore, I'm his youngest daughter who got swept up in some modern military program that hands out fancy titles for what amounts to glorified tech support. In his mind, I sit in air-conditioned offices, far from any real danger, clicking through computer screens while actual soldiers do the heavy lifting. He pictures me as part of some bloated bureaucracy, a participation trophy generation that gets medals for showing up and keeping servers running. The reality? I'm Lieutenant Colonel Audrey Moore, Director of Advanced Threat Response for the 24th Cyber Operations Squadron. I hold the highest security clearance available to active duty personnel. I've spent more time in secure command bunkers during active operations than most infantry officers spend in combat zones. And for the past 3 years, I've been the primary architect of the defensive systems that keep hostile nations from turning our own weapons against us. The night before his birthday party, I sat in my childhood bedroom, the same room where I'd once dreamed of making him proud, and I pulled out my secure tablet to review the latest intelligence briefing. 3 separate nations had attempted coordinated cyber attacks on U.S. military infrastructure in the past month alone. 3 attacks that failed because of systems my team had designed and protocols I had personally written. But Dad didn't know about those attacks because they never made the evening news. Success in cyber warfare is measured by the disasters that don't happen, the wars that never start, the soldiers who come home safely because their communications never got compromised. It's a world of invisible victories and classified heroics. My specialty is something called adaptive network defense. Think of it as building a fortress that can rebuild itself faster than enemies can tear it down. When hostile actors try to penetrate military networks, they're not just facing firewalls and passwords. They're facing AI-driven response systems that learn from each attack attempt, predict future intrusion vectors, and coordinate counterstrikes across multiple domains simultaneously. I pioneered the technology that's now standard across NATO forces. The Moore protocol, they call it, though Dad would never know that name appears in classified briefings from Brussels to Seoul. It's a real-time threat neutralization system that can identify, isolate, and eliminate cyber threats in under 12 seconds. 12 seconds that can mean the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophic intelligence breach. During my last deployment to Ramstein, I led a team of 37 specialists from 8 different countries. We weren't just protecting American interests, we were protecting the entire Western Alliance's digital infrastructure. For 18 months, we worked in rotating shifts, monitoring global threat levels, responding to attacks that ranged from sophisticated state-sponsored operations to terrorist organizations trying to weaponize civilian infrastructure. The closest call came 6 months ago. A coordinated attack targeted the GPS systems that guide everything from supply convoys to missile defense networks. If it had succeeded, every Allied operation in 3 separate combat theaters would have gone dark simultaneously. Thousands of soldiers would have lost communication, navigation, and fire support in hostile territory. We had 14 minutes to trace the source, identify the attack vectors, and deploy countermeasures. 14 minutes while Pentagon brass watched over our shoulders and Allied commanders held their breath. I personally wrote the code that not only stopped the attack, but traced it back to its source servers and delivered a response that shut down the hostile network for 6 weeks. The after-action report credited our intervention with preventing what could have been the most devastating military defeat since Pearl Harbor. The Secretary of Defense personally signed the commendation. 3 Allied nations offered me citizenship based on that operation alone. But when I called Dad to tell him about the recognition, all he said was, "That's nice, honey. Your brother just got a contract to build a new shopping center." See, Dad's military experience was forged in a different era. His war had clear front lines, identifiable enemies, and victories you could measure in territory gained or casualties inflicted. He understood the weight of a rifle, the importance of tactical positioning, the brotherhood forged under enemy fire. All of that was real, and all of that mattered. But his war was also 20 years in the past. The threats facing today's military don't wear uniforms or carry flags. They sit in anonymous buildings halfway around the world, launching attacks that can disable aircraft carriers without firing a single shot. They can turn our own defense systems against us, scramble communications networks, and leave entire armies blind and defenseless in hostile territory. That's the war I've been fighting. Not with bullets or explosions, but with code and strategy and the kind of technical precision that makes the difference between global security and international chaos. Every day, hostile actors probe our networks, looking for weaknesses they can exploit. Every day, people like me stand guard, preventing digital Pearl Harbors that would make Dad's conventional wars seem quaint by comparison. The dismissal didn't start with my military career. It started the day I chose computers over cheerleading in high school. I was 16, sitting at our kitchen table with college brochures spread out like playing cards, when Dad walked in wearing his dress uniform. He'd just returned from a ceremony at Fort Carson, chest full of ribbons, that familiar swagger that came with being respected in his world. "What's all this?" he asked, glancing at the MIT and Carnegie Mellon pamphlets. "Computer science programs," I said, excited to share my plans. "I want to study cybersecurity. The military is going to need people who understand digital threats." He laughed, actually laughed, like I just told him I wanted to become a professional unicorn trainer. "Sweetheart," he said, settling into his chair, with that patronizing tone I'd learned to dread. "Computers are tools, hammers and screwdrivers for the digital age. You don't build a career around using tools. You build careers around leading people, making hard decisions, facing real challenges." That was 1995. The internet was still something most people used for email and basic research. The idea that entire wars could be fought through fiber optic cables seemed like science fiction. To Dad, suggesting that computer skills might be crucial to national defense was like suggesting we'd need professional video game players in the military. But I'd seen something he couldn't see yet.
Even at 16, I understood that the future of conflict wouldn't just be about controlling territory, it would be about controlling information. I'd watched the Gulf War on CNN, seen how precision-guided weapons and satellite communications gave us advantages that traditional military thinking couldn't match. The next logical step was obvious. Whoever controlled the digital battlefield would control everything else. Dad had different plans for me. You should consider nursing, he'd suggest. Military nurses are respected. They serve close to the action, help real soldiers with real injuries. Or teaching. You could work on base, support military families, contribute something meaningful. The underlying message was always the same. Find a way to support the real military, the people doing actual work, instead of pretending I could be one of them. By the time I graduated high school, the pattern was set. Derek, my older brother, announced he was joining the Army Corps of Engineers, and Dad couldn't contain his pride. Building infrastructure, supporting combat operations, he'd boast to neighbors, that's real military service. Rachel chose nursing, exactly as Dad had hoped, and he'd introduce her as my daughter who serves our troops. But when I joined ROTC and declared my intention to pursue military intelligence with a focus on information systems, his enthusiasm died like someone had unplugged it. Information systems, he'd repeat slowly, testing the words like they tasted bitter. So you'll be filing reports? Managing databases? I'll be protecting our networks from foreign interference, making sure enemy forces can't compromise our communications or turn our own systems against us. His eyes would glaze over, that familiar look that meant he'd already stopped listening. Well, every unit needs administrative support.
The worst part wasn't his ignorance about what I was learning. The worst part was his determination to stay ignorant. When I tried to explain how cyber warfare was evolving, he'd cut me off with jokes about keyboard warriors and digital desk jockeys. When I'd show him articles about Russian hackers targeting power grids or Chinese infiltration of government networks, he'd wave them away. "Let me know when they learn to shoot back," he'd say dismissively. During my junior year at the Air Force Academy, I won the National Cyber Defense Competition. My team defeated representatives from 43 other military academies and civilian universities. The scenario involved protecting critical infrastructure from a coordinated multi-vector attack while maintaining operational capabilities for ongoing military exercises. We were the only team that successfully maintained full defensive posture while identifying and neutralizing all threat vectors. I called home, breathless with excitement, ready to share this victory with someone who might finally understand its significance. "That's nice, honey," Dad said. "Your brother just made sergeant. We're taking him out to celebrate." He'd missed the point entirely. Derek's promotion was routine, good performance, following a predictable path. My victory represented something unprecedented. Proof that cyber defense wasn't just technical support, but strategic warfare that required the same tactical thinking, quick decision-making, and leadership skills that Dad claimed to value. But to him, competitions weren't combat, simulations weren't real-world experience, and anything involving computers remained fundamentally separate from actual military service. The pattern continued through my commissioning, my first assignment, my initial deployments. Every achievement got filtered through his narrow understanding of what military service should look like. When I made first lieutenant ahead of schedule, he assumed it was grade inflation. When I earned my first Bronze Star for actions during a cyber attack on forward operating bases in Afghanistan, he suggested the standards had been lowered to include support personnel. The Bronze Star citation specifically mentioned my leadership during a coordinated attack that had disabled communication systems for 3 combat units simultaneously. For 6 hours, I'd worked with minimal sleep and maximum pressure to restore critical links while enemy forces used the communication blackout to advance on our positions. My team's work didn't just restore communications, it provided tactical advantages that turned a potential disaster into a strategic victory. But Dad never read the full citation.
He saw computer-related service and filed it mentally alongside participation trophies and administrative achievements. By my 10th year of service, I'd stopped sharing details about promotions, commendations, or assignments. Family dinners became exercises in selective silence, where Derek's construction projects and Rachel's hospital stories dominated conversation, while my deployments got summarized as computer work overseas. The final straw came 3 years ago during my last visit home before the Ramstein assignment. I'd just been selected for the Joint Task Force position, a role that would put me in charge of cyber defense for the entire European theater. It was the kind of assignment that typically went to full colonels with 20 years of experience. At 32, I was the youngest officer ever selected for that level of responsibility. I was proud, excited, ready to share this milestone with family who might finally recognize its significance. So, I'll be coordinating network security for all NATO operations, managing cyber threat assessment for multiple countries, working directly with allied commanders. Dad set down his fork and looked at me with that expression I knew too well, the one that meant he was about to deliver wisdom that would put me in my proper place. Audrey, it's important to stay humble about these things. You're very good at your specialty, but remember, there are people doing the real fighting while you're managing computer systems. Don't let all these fancy titles go to your head. That's when I realized he wasn't just ignorant about my work, he was actively committed to diminishing it. Even when presented with evidence that my role was strategic, critical, and recognized by the highest levels of military leadership, he would find ways to minimize it. So I stopped trying to convince him, stopped explaining, stopped hoping, stopped caring whether he understood the difference between tech support and tactical command. But I never stopped earning respect from the people who mattered. And tomorrow, on his 65th birthday, some of those people were going to show him exactly what they thought of his daughter's pretend job. The invitation to Dad's party came through Mom, which should have been my first warning sign. I was in my quarters at Ramstein, 3 weeks deep into analyzing a series of coordinated probing attacks against European defense networks, when my secure phone buzzed with a civilian call. Mom's voice crackled through the encrypted line, bright and hopeful in that way that meant she was about to ask for something she knew I didn't want to give. "Your father's turning 65 next month," she said without preamble. "We're throwing him a big party. All his old unit buddies, the VFW crowd, everyone from church. It would mean so much if you could be there." I stared at the threat assessment report scattered across my desk, evidence of increasing hostility from state actors who were getting bolder, more sophisticated, more dangerous. The kind of work that kept me up at night because lives literally hung on the balance of getting it right. "Mom, I'm in the middle of something critical here. Can't Derek and Rachel handle the family representation?" The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just about celebration. It was about something else entirely. He's been different lately, since he retired last year. You know how your father gets when he feels like the world is moving past him. He talks about the old days constantly, about when military service meant something, about how today's generation doesn't understand real sacrifice.
I could read between those lines. Dad was struggling with retirement, feeling irrelevant in a world where warfare had evolved beyond his understanding. And somehow, my absence had become symbolic of everything that was wrong with modern military service. "He asks about you," Mom continued. "Not directly, but he'll see something on the news about cyber attacks or computer hackers, and he'll make comments. Wonder what Audrey thinks about that. Or maybe Audrey's people are involved in fixing that. I think he's trying to understand, honey. He just doesn't know how." The hope in her voice was heartbreaking, because I'd heard it before. Every Christmas, every birthday, every family gathering I'd missed over the years, Mom always believed that this time would be different. This time, Dad would finally see me for who I really was, instead of who he thought I should be. But I also heard something else in her voice. Exhaustion. She'd been mediating between Dad's dismissiveness and my absence for years, trying to build bridges across a gap that seemed to widen with every promotion, every deployment, every achievement that he couldn't categorize within his understanding of military service. And, honestly, she added quietly, some of his friends have been asking questions about why you never visit, why you're not involved in family celebrations. You know how small-town military communities are. People talk. There it was, the real reason for this call. Dad's reputation in his tight-knit community of retired military was being affected by my absence. In his world, family unity reflected military values. A daughter who stayed away, who didn't participate in honoring her father's service, raised uncomfortable questions about what kind of leader he'd been at home. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to explain that I'd tried for years to be part of those celebrations, only to be treated like a distant cousin who'd wandered into someone else's family reunion. I wanted to remind her of all the times I'd shared my achievements with enthusiasm, only to watch Dad's eyes glaze over with disinterest. But I also heard something else in her voice that made me pause. Genuine worry. Not just about Dad's ego or community standing, but about him. About a man who'd built his identity around military leadership and was struggling to find his place in a world where his experience seemed increasingly irrelevant. "What kind of party?" I asked, already knowing I was making a mistake. The relief in her voice was immediate and overwhelming. Nothing too fancy. We're renting the community center at the base. About 100 people, mostly his old squadron mates and local veterans. Some speeches, war stories, you know how these things go. Just family showing up to honor his service. Family showing up? As if I hadn't been showing up for my country every day for 13 years, just in ways that didn't fit Dad's definition of service. "I'll need to arrange leave," I said slowly, watching my calendar fill with the implications of this decision. 3 days away from critical operations, 3 days when my team would be monitoring global threats without their commanding officer present. "Of course, honey, we understand you're busy with your computer work." Computer work. Even Mom, who'd been my strongest supporter, had absorbed Dad's vocabulary for describing what I did. It wasn't malicious. She genuinely didn't understand the technical aspects of cyber warfare any more than he did. But the casual dismissiveness had become so normalized in our family that even expressions of support carried undertones of minimalization. After I hung up, I sat in my quarters, staring at the intelligence reports that covered my desk. 3 different hostile nations were currently probing NATO networks, testing our defenses, looking for weaknesses they could exploit. The work I was doing wasn't theoretical or administrative. It was active defense against sophisticated adversaries who understood, even if my father didn't, that the next major conflict would be won or lost in digital space. But I committed to 3 days away from that battlefield to attend a party where my 13 years of service would be summarized as computer work, and my strategic role in defending Western democracy would be treated as a hobby that had gotten out of hand. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I was protecting the infrastructure that kept Dad's comfortable retirement secure, the banking systems that delivered his pension, the communication networks that connected him to his grandchildren, the power grids that kept his lights on, he remained convinced that my work was somehow less vital than his 20-year-old war stories. I called my second-in-command, Major Patricia Lynch, to arrange coverage for my absence. Patricia was brilliant, capable, and understood the strategic importance of our mission in ways that transcended ego or recognition. "Family emergency?" she asked when I explained the situation. "Family obligation," I corrected. "My father's birthday party." "Ah," the understanding in her voice was immediate. Patricia came from a military family, understood the complex dynamics of trying to honor traditions that didn't always honor you back. "Want me to brief you on anything critical before you go?" "Actually, yes. I've made a decision. I want full documentation of our current operations, threat assessments, and recent interventions. Unclassified summaries, suitable for civilian briefing. Planning to do some education while you're home? Something like that?" But as I began preparing for the trip, reviewing the documentation that would travel with me, I realized I wasn't planning education, I was planning something more like surrender. Not surrender to Dad's dismissiveness, but surrender of my need for his approval. For years, I'd oscillated between trying to earn his respect and pretending I didn't need it. But somewhere in that secure facility, surrounded by evidence of my team's critical work, I'd reached a different conclusion entirely. I didn't need Dad to understand my service. I didn't need him to appreciate the strategic importance of cyber warfare or recognize the leadership skills required for my position. I didn't need him to be proud of me. But I was done allowing his ignorance to diminish the significance of what I did. And if attending his birthday party meant enduring 3 days of patronizing comments about my computer thing, then so be it. Because I had a feeling this party was going to be more interesting than anyone expected, especially when the RSVPs I'd received from some very important people started showing up in person. The Peterson Air Force Base Community Center looked like 4th of July had exploded inside a VFW hall and landed in suburban Colorado Springs. I stood in the parking lot at 1400 hours on a crisp Saturday afternoon, watching civilian contractors hang the last of the red, white, and blue streamers across the entrance. American flags lined the walkway like a patriotic honor guard, snapping in the mountain wind. A banner stretched across the double doors read, "Celebrating 65 Years of Honor, Colonel James Moore," in bold letters that could be seen from the highway. The parking lot was already half full, and it told a story. Pickup trucks with faded military unit stickers in the rear windows, sedans with Purple Heart license plates, a restored 1970s Camaro with Vietnam veteran emblazoned across the windshield. This wasn't just a birthday party. It was a gathering of Dad's tribe, the brotherhood he'd belonged to since before I was born. I recognized some of the faces emerging from vehicles. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who'd served under Dad in Germany and now works security at the nearby Cheyenne Mountain Complex. Chief Warrant Officer Thompson, Dad's old helicopter mechanic, who'd moved to Colorado after retirement and started a small aircraft repair business. These were men who understood warfare through the lens of mechanical precision, tactical maneuvers, and boots-on-ground leadership. They nodded respectfully when they saw me in my dress blues, but I could see the questions in their eyes. They knew Dad had a daughter in the military, but details were always vague. Something with computers was usually the extent of it, delivered with the kind of apologetic shrug that suggested it wasn't quite the same as real military work. Inside, the transformation was complete. The community center had been converted into a shrine to conventional military service. Tables arranged in precise formation, each covered with Fred tablecloths and small American flag centerpieces. The walls were lined with poster boards displaying photographs from Dad's 25-year career. Him as a young second lieutenant, fresh out of flight school, grinning next to a UH-1 Huey, leading his maintenance crew in front of a hangar in Germany, receiving his Bronze Star for actions during Desert Storm, his final promotion ceremony to full colonel. But the centerpiece was a display table near the entrance that took my breath away, and not in a good way. Someone had assembled a comprehensive exhibit of the Moore military legacy, complete with professionally mounted photographs, medals under glass, and typed descriptions of service highlights. Grandpa Moore's World War II service medals anchored one end, Dad's Vietnam and Desert Storm decorations dominated the center, Derek's Army Corps of Engineers commendations filled another section. And me? A single 5x7 photograph from my commissioning ceremony, tucked between Derek's display and a potted plant. The nameplate read, Lieutenant Audrey Moore, Information Systems. Lieutenant, not Lieutenant Colonel, Information Systems, not Advanced Threat Response or Joint Task Force Command or any of the titles that actually reflected what I did. Someone had deliberately used my rank from 13 years ago and the most generic description possible for my career field. I stood there for a long moment, studying that display, feeling something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't accidental. This wasn't ignorance or oversight.
This was intentional minimization, a calculated decision to represent me as the family member who'd chosen a safe, technical role while the men handled the dangerous, important work. Audrey! Mom's voice cut through my analysis. She appeared at my elbow, radiant in a navy blue dress that complemented her silver hair, looking genuinely delighted to see me. You made it, and you look so professional in your uniform. Everyone's going to be so impressed. I gestured toward the display. Interesting presentation of family history. Mom followed my gaze, and her smile faltered slightly. Your father and his friends put that together. I think they were trying to keep things simple. You know how complicated your job description can be for people to understand. Simple. There was that word again. The one that had followed me through family gatherings for over a decade. Keep it simple so people don't get confused by the technical details. Keep it simple so we don't have to explain things that don't fit traditional military narratives. Where should I sit? I asked, changing the subject before I said something that would ruin Mom's carefully orchestrated celebration. Oh, we have you at table 7 with some of the younger veterans, people closer to your age who might understand your generation's approach to military service better.
Table 7 was in the back corner, near the kitchen doors and farthest from the head table, where Dad would hold court with his contemporaries, the modern military equivalent of the kids' table at Thanksgiving dinner. As guests continued arriving, I watched the demographics fill in like a sociological study. The front tables filled with Dad's squadron mates, mostly men in their 60s and 70s who'd served during Vietnam and the Cold War. Their conversations carried the casual authority of people who'd shared foxholes and flight lines, who understood each other's references without explanation. The middle tables welcomed local VFW members, American Legion post commanders, and retired NCOs who'd built careers on discipline, tradition, and clearly defined hierarchies. These were people who measured military success in tangible terms: time and grade, combat deployments, leadership of large units, decorations earned under fire. And in the back, at tables like mine, sat the outliers. A female Air Force major who worked in logistics, a Navy IT specialist who deployed with information warfare units, a couple of younger Army officers whose military occupational specialties didn't exist when Dad was an active duty colonel. We were the new military, the ones who fought wars through fiber optic cables and satellite links, who commanded through keyboards and managed operations from climate-controlled facilities thousands of miles from traditional battlefields. We were also the ones whose service didn't translate well to war stories at VFW barbecues. The sound system crackled to life, testing microphones for the evening's speeches. A local DJ started playing background music, military marches mixed with classic rock from the 1970s, the soundtrack of Dad's generation's war experience. The volume was just loud enough to provide ambient noise without overwhelming conversation. Staff from the catering company moved efficiently between tables, setting up the evening's dinner service. Nothing fancy, just classic American fare. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, dinner rolls. The kind of meal that reflected traditional values and unpretentious celebration. Dad worked the room like the natural leader he'd always been, moving from table to table with practiced ease, shaking hands, sharing brief conversations, making sure every guest felt welcomed and valued. He wore his dress blue uniform, ribbons and medals arranged in perfect formation, silver eagles gleaming on his shoulders. At 65, he still carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to command. When he reached my table, his smile was genuine, but careful. Audrey, glad you could make it. I know how busy you are with your work overseas. Wouldn't miss it, Dad, I replied, standing to embrace him. Congratulations on reaching the milestone. He glanced at my dress uniform, taking in the ribbons and rank insignia I'd earned over 13 years of service. For just a moment, I thought I saw something like pride flicker across his expression, but then his attention shifted to the other guests at my table, people whose military experience he could more easily categorize and understand. As he moved away, continuing his rounds, I noticed something that made me check my watch. 14:45 hours. The party officially started at 1500,
but I was expecting some additional guests who might arrive fashionably late. Guests whose presence would shift the entire dynamic of this carefully orchestrated celebration of traditional military values. I'd made some phone calls during my trip preparation, reached out to a few contacts who understood the strategic importance of the work I did, not to embarrass Dad or prove a point, but because they'd expressed interest in meeting the family of someone they considered a critical asset to national security. What I hadn't expected was how enthusiastically they'd responded to the invitation, or how their presence might change not just Dad's understanding of my career, but the entire room's perception of what modern military service actually looked like. The next hour was going to be very interesting. The conversations started exactly as I had expected them to. "So, Audrey," said retired Chief Master Sergeant Williams, settling into his chair at my table with a plate of roast beef, "your dad says you work with computers in the Air Force? That must be interesting." The tone was polite, the kind of careful courtesy extended to someone's relative whose job you don't quite understand but don't want to dismiss outright. Around the table, other guests leaned in with the mild curiosity of people making small talk. "I work in cyber operations," I replied evenly. "Network defense, threat assessment, that sort of thing." "Ah, like IT support for the military?" asked Captain Reynolds, who'd retired from the Navy after commanding a destroyer during the Gulf War. "Keeping the email systems running, managing databases." I could feel the familiar weight settling on my shoulders. Here was again the automatic assumption that anything involving computers must be clerical, administrative, support-oriented. Never strategic, never command level, never critical to actual military operations. "I'm more like defending military networks from hostile attacks," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Preventing enemy forces from compromising our communications or weapons systems." Chief Williams nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. Gotta keep the bad guys out of our computer systems. Must be challenging work, all that technical stuff." Technical stuff. As if protecting the digital infrastructure that enabled everything from GPS-guided munitions to real-time intelligence sharing was equivalent to troubleshooting printer problems. Before I could respond, Mrs. Henderson from Table 3 approached with a warm smile. She'd been a military spouse for 30 years, following her husband through multiple deployments and duty stations. "Audrey, dear, we haven't seen you at one of these gatherings in years. Still doing that computer thing?"
Computer thing. The phrase followed me like a shadow at every military social event I'd ever attended. My work, defending critical infrastructure, reduced to a thing, like a hobby that had gotten out of hand. "I've been deployed overseas," I explained, "leading cyber defense operations for NATO forces." "Oh, how wonderful!" She beamed with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for children's art projects. "It's so important that someone keeps track of all those technical details. I'm sure the real soldiers appreciate having people like you handling the complicated computer work so they can focus on fighting." The real soldiers. There it was. The distinction that cut deeper than any direct insult. I wasn't a real soldier in her understanding. I was support staff, someone who enabled the important work that other people did. From across the room, I caught fragments of other conversations that painted the same picture. Dad was regaling a group of his former squadron mates with stories about Derek's construction company, how he'd built a successful business using the leadership skills he'd learned in the Army Corps of Engineers. "That's what military training does," Dad was saying, gesturing with his beer. "Teaches you to lead people, manage complex projects, make decisions under pressure. Those skills transfer to any field." Then someone asked about me, and the energy shifted subtly. "Oh, Audrey's very smart," Dad said, and I could hear the careful tone he used when navigating topics he didn't want to explore too deeply. "She does cybersecurity work. Very technical, very specialized. Above my pay grade, honestly." Above my pay grade. It sounded complimentary, but I recognized the deflection technique. By positioning my work as too complex for him to understand, he avoided having to explain or defend its importance. It was dismissal wrapped in false modesty. "But she's an officer, right?" asked Master Sergeant Rodriguez. "What's her rank?" There was a pause, just long enough to be noticeable. "Lieutenant Colonel," Dad said finally, and I could hear the reluctance in his voice, as if admitting my rank somehow diminished his own accomplishments. "Lieutenant Colonel at 35? Rodriguez sounded impressed. "That's fast-track promotion. Must be doing something right." Another pause. "Different career fields have different promotion timelines," Dad said diplomatically. "Technical specialties sometimes move faster because there's less competition." Less competition. As if my promotions were participation trophies, handed out because nobody else wanted jobs that involved actual responsibility for national security. As if cyber warfare command positions were somehow easier to achieve than traditional military leadership roles. I watched this pattern repeat throughout the evening. Every time someone expressed genuine interest in my career, Dad would find ways to minimize it. When Colonel Martinez asked about my deployments, Dad mentioned that I'd been stationed in Europe, without acknowledging that I'd commanded joint task forces. When Chief Petty Officer Johnson inquired about my responsibilities, Dad described them as very technical, very specialized, without mentioning that I'd written the defensive protocols now used across all NATO networks. The breaking point came when I overheard him talking to a group of local VFW members near the memorial display. "It's a different military today," he was saying, shaking his head with the weary expression of someone lamenting the decline of standards. "Everything's computerized, automated. Kids today think they're warriors because they can operate complex machinery. But when it comes to real leadership, real decision-making under fire, real sacrifice, that's something you can only learn through traditional military experience." "What about your daughter?" asked someone I didn't recognize. "She seems to have done well for herself." Dad glanced in my direction, and for a moment our eyes met across the crowded room. "Audrey's very good at what she does," he said carefully. "But what she does is different. It's important work, don't get me wrong. Someone has to manage all the technical systems, but it's not the same as leading troops in combat, making life and death decisions with enemy fire coming at you." Someone has to manage all the technical systems. As if my role was custodial, maintenance-level work that kept the real military's equipment functioning properly. I turned back to my table, where the conversation had moved on to safer topics: grandchildren, retirement plans, local sports teams. But I could feel the weight of those dismissive comments settling around me like fog. This wasn't just about Dad's inability to understand modern warfare. It was about his active choice to diminish my service so it didn't complicate his narrative about what military leadership looked like. Around the room, I noticed similar patterns in other conversations. The younger veterans at my table spoke quietly among themselves about feeling misunderstood by the older generation. The female officers shared subtle eye rolls when traditional gender roles were casually reinforced through seemingly innocent comments. The technical specialists found themselves explaining repeatedly that their work involved more than just computers. We were all experiencing the same phenomenon, being politely but systematically excluded from the definition of real military service. Our contributions acknowledged but not respected. Our expertise recognized but not valued. At 16:30 hours, I excused myself from the table and stepped outside for some fresh air. The parking lot was fuller now, with late arrivals still trickling in. I pulled out my secure phone to check messages, partly for legitimate operational updates, but mostly to remind myself that there was a world beyond this community center where my work was understood and appreciated. 3 new messages waited for me, all from contacts I'd reached out to earlier in the week. Confirmation messages, arrival time updates, and one that made me smile despite my frustration. "Looking forward to meeting your family. Time to show them what modern warfare leadership actually looks like." I checked my watch again, 16:45 hours. The formal program was scheduled to begin at 1700, with speeches and presentations honoring Dad's service. But I had a feeling the evening's real education was about to begin shortly after that. Because while Dad and his friends were busy diminishing the importance of cyber warfare and technical military specialties, 3 people were about to walk through those doors who understood exactly how critical my work had been to their own success. 3 people whose opinions carried considerably more weight than a room full of retired colonels and master sergeants. 3 people who were going to change this conversation permanently. At 1700 hours sharp, the formal program began with military precision. Master of Ceremonies duties fell to retired Command Sergeant Major Peterson, Dad's old friend from Fort Carson, who'd made a career out of running ceremonies like this one. His voice boomed through the sound system with the practiced authority of someone who'd conducted countless military functions. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. We're here tonight to honor a man who dedicated 25 years of his life to defending freedom, Colonel James Moore. The room quieted respectfully, conversations fading as guests turned toward the head table where Dad sat with Mom and his closest military friends. He looked comfortable in the spotlight, shoulders back, chin high, every inch the distinguished officer who'd earned the respect being shown tonight. We'll begin with a presentation of Colonel Moore's service record, followed by remarks from several of his former colleagues and commanders. But first, I'd like to invite his family to join him at the head table for recognition. My stomach tightened. This was the moment I'd been dreading. Being paraded in front of the room as part of Dad's supporting cast, the military daughter who'd chosen a different path but deserved acknowledgement for trying. Derek stood first, straightening his civilian suit as he made his way to the front. Applause followed him, warm and appreciative. Someone called out, "Army Corps of Engineers!" and Derek nodded with pride. He belonged here, understood by this crowd as someone who'd served in a traditionally respected role. Rachel followed, radiant in her uniform as a military nurse. More applause, more recognition. "Supporting our wounded warriors," someone else shouted. She waved graciously, another family member whose service fit comfortably within this room's understanding of military contribution. Then all eyes turned to me. I stood slowly, acutely aware of how every person in that room was trying to categorize what I represented. My dress blues were immaculate, my ribbons and rank insignia properly displayed, my bearing professional. But I could feel the uncertainty in their gaze, the polite confusion of people who weren't sure how to react to my presence. The applause was polite, but noticeably softer. Not dismissive, but careful. The kind of response reserved for someone whose role you don't quite understand, but don't want to insult. "The Moore family," Sergeant Major Peterson announced as we reached the head table. "A tradition of service spanning 3 generations. Derek, Army Corps of Engineers. Rachel, military nursing. And Audrey, who serves in cyber operations." Cyber operations. Even Peterson, a seasoned NCO who'd worked with every type of military specialty imaginable, delivered my job description with slight hesitation, as if he wasn't entirely sure what it meant. We took our seats at the head table, and I found myself positioned at the far end, next to the floral centerpiece and away from the main conversation flow. The seating arrangement was subtle but deliberate. Family members arranged by perceived importance of their military contribution. The formal presentations began with a slideshow chronicling Dad's career. Professional photographs from his commissioning ceremony, training exercises, deployments, and promotion ceremonies. The narrator, one of his former squadron commanders, provided context for each image with the practiced delivery of someone who'd given similar tributes many times. "Jim Moore represented everything we value in military leadership," Colonel Williamson explained as images of Dad in various command positions flashed on screen. "Integrity, courage, dedication to his troops, and unwavering commitment to mission accomplishment." The audience nodded appreciatively. These values they understood, demonstrated through service they could easily visualize and respect. His leadership during Operation Desert Shield showed what it means to prepare your unit for combat under impossible timelines. His maintenance crews worked around the clock to ensure every aircraft was mission-ready when the call came. More applause. Stories like this resonated with everyone in the room because they involved tangible challenges with clear solutions.
mechanical problems fixed through technical expertise and leadership, troops motivated through personal example, equipment maintained through attention to detail and professional competence. What followed was a comprehensive celebration of traditional military virtues. Speaker after speaker rose to share stories about Dad's leadership style, his mentorship of younger officers, his ability to maintain morale during difficult deployments. Each anecdote reinforced the same theme. Effective military service meant leading people through challenging circumstances using time-tested principles. Then came the family tributes. Derek spoke first, sharing stories about how Dad's military discipline had influenced his approach to business leadership. He taught me that complex projects succeed through attention to detail, clear communication, and taking care of your team. Those lessons from the Army Corps of Engineers built the foundation for everything I've accomplished in civilian construction. The audience connected immediately with this narrative, military skills translating directly to civilian success through leadership principles that cross professional boundaries.
Again, perfect resonance with the room's values. Medical care for military personnel represented sacrifice, compassion, and direct contribution to troop welfare that everyone could understand and appreciate. Then, Peterson called my name. I approached the podium with measured steps, aware that every person in that room was waiting to hear how the cyber operations daughter would fit into this narrative of traditional military service. Silence felt heavier than usual. Expectant, but uncertain. "Thank you all for honoring my father tonight," I began, looking out over faces that ranged from genuinely interested to politely tolerant. Dad's example taught me that military service requires dedication to something larger than yourself. Safe opening, drawing connections to shared values without getting into specifics that might lose the audience. My path has been different from his, working in areas that didn't exist when he was learning to lead soldiers. But the principles remain the same: protecting the people who depend on you, staying ahead of emerging threats, and ensuring mission success regardless of personal cost. I paused, watching faces around the room. Some nodded politely. Others looked slightly confused by my abstract language about emerging threats and mission success, without concrete details they could visualize. Dad's generation defended freedom through conventional military strength. My generation defends it through different means, but with the same commitment to keeping Americans safe. The applause that followed was respectful, but restrained. I'd managed to connect my service to Dad's without saying anything specific enough to challenge anyone's assumptions about what I actually did. As I returned to my seat, I caught Dad's expression. He looked relieved that I'd kept my remarks general, avoided technical details that might confuse his guests, and maintained focus on honoring his service rather than promoting my own achievements. The program continued with additional speakers, each reinforcing the same themes about traditional military leadership and conventional definitions of military success. By the time Peterson announced the final presentation, a ceremonial sword from the local VFW chapter, it was clear that this evening had been designed to celebrate a very specific understanding of what military service looked like. An understanding that left no room for cyber warfare, technical specialties, or the kind of strategic leadership that happened behind computer screens rather than on conventional battlefields. As guests moved toward the reception area for coffee and dessert, I found myself drawn back to the memorial display that had caught my attention earlier. Something about that single photograph of me, deliberately mislabeled and minimized, kept pulling at me like a splinter under the skin. I stood there studying the exhibit more carefully, and that's when I saw it, something that made my blood run cold. Tucked behind Derek's Army Corps of Engineers commendations, partially hidden by a folded program, was a framed certificate I recognized immediately. My Bronze Star citation from the Afghan Network Defense Operation, the one Dad had specifically asked to be kept private because it might complicate the family narrative. But it wasn't the original citation.
Someone had made a photocopy and altered it. Where the original read, "For exceptionally meritorious achievement in the conduct of military operations against an armed enemy while serving as Cyber Defense Operation Commander during coordinated attacks against forward operating base communication systems," the display version read, "For meritorious service in technical support operations while assigned to communications systems maintenance." My hands started shaking as I pulled the frame closer to examine it. They had changed my rank from major to specialist. They had changed operations commander to assigned to. They had changed coordinated attacks against forward operating base communication systems to communications systems maintenance. This wasn't just dismissal or misunderstanding. This was deliberate falsification of my military record. I looked around the display more carefully and found 2 other certificates that have been similarly altered. My NATO Joint Task Force appointment letter, which originally designated me as Primary Strategic Cyber Defense Coordinator for European Theater Operations, now read Administrative Liaison for European Computer Systems. My commendation for preventing the GPS attack that could have crippled 3 Allied operations had been changed from leadership of critical real-time response that prevented catastrophic system failure affecting thousands of personnel to technical assistance with computer network maintenance. Someone had gone through my records systematically, changing every indication of command authority, strategic responsibility, or critical mission impact. They'd turned 13 years of progressively important leadership roles into a career of technical support and administrative assistance. The worst part wasn't just the changes themselves. The worst part was how carefully they'd been done. Professional printing, official-looking formatting, attention to detail that suggested significant time and effort. This wasn't a careless mistake or casual dismissal. This was intentional rewriting of history. I pulled out my phone and started photographing the altered documents, my hands still trembling with a mixture of rage and betrayal that I'd never experienced before. Because this went beyond Dad's inability to understand modern warfare. This was active sabotage of my military reputation, done in front of his entire social circle.
Audrey? Mom's voice startled me. She'd approached quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee, her face showing the kind of careful concern that meant she'd been watching me for several minutes. "Mom," I said, my voice tighter than I intended, "did you know about this?" She followed my gaze to the display, and her face went pale. "Know about what, honey?" I showed her the altered Bronze Star citation, pointing out the changes. Someone took my actual military records and falsified them, changed my rank, my position, my responsibilities, made it look like I've spent 13 years doing clerical work. Mom set down the coffee cups with hands that weren't quite steady. "Oh, sweetheart, I had no idea. Your father and his friends put this together. I thought they were just simplifying things." Simplifying? The word came out sharper than I'd meant. "Mom, this isn't simplification. This is fraud. They've created false military documents." She looked around nervously, checking to see if anyone was listening to our conversation. Maybe they just didn't understand the technical language. Maybe they were trying to make it more accessible to people who aren't familiar with modern military terminology. But even as she said it, I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe it. Because the changes weren't random or confused. They were systematic and purposeful, designed to transform a record of command responsibility into a history of support functions. "Mom, they changed operations commander to assigned to. They changed strategic coordinator to administrative liaison. Those aren't translation errors. Those are deliberate alterations meant to diminish my service record." She picked up one of the coffee cups and held it like a shield, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Your father, he's been struggling since retirement, feeling like the world has moved past him, like
The military he understood doesn't exist anymore. When people ask about you, about your promotions and responsibilities, it reminds him that he doesn't understand what's important now. I stared at her, processing what she was really telling me. So he decided to write my record to make himself more comfortable? I think he convinced himself he was protecting you, making your service more understandable to people who might not appreciate technical military specialties. Protecting me by falsifying my achievements and presenting me as someone who'd never held command authority or strategic responsibility? That's when something broke inside me. Not anger, not hurt, something colder and more final. Because this wasn't about Dad's inability to understand cyber warfare or his discomfort with modern military service. This was about his willingness to damage my reputation to preserve his own sense of relevance. I looked around the room, seeing the evening differently now. Every polite smile, every careful question about my computer work, every assumption that I was support staff rather than command authority, it was all based on information Dad had deliberately provided. He'd spent years telling people I was technical support, administrative assistance, clerical staff. And tonight, he'd made it official, with falsified military documents displayed for his entire social circle to see. "Audrey," Mom said quietly, "please don't make a scene. Not tonight. Not at his birthday party." I turned to face her fully. "Mom, he's displayed fake military records in front of retired officers and senior NCOs who know what these documents are supposed to look like. Do you understand what this could do to my career if anyone reported it?" She flinched at the implications. "I'm sure no one would. Master Sergeant Rodriguez is here. He works security at Cheyenne Martin. He reviews classified personnel files every day. Colonel Martinez commanded security forces for NORAD. Chief Petty Officer Johnson spent 30 years in naval intelligence." Her face went even paler as she realized what I was telling her. Half the room was filled with people whose jobs involved verifying military credentials and detecting falsified documents. "What do you want me to do?" she asked helplessly. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced down and saw 3 words that changed everything. "We're here. Parking." I looked at Mom, then at the falsified display, then at Dad across the room holding court with his friends while proudly showing off the memorial that presented his daughter as someone she'd never been. I want you to watch what happens when people who actually understand my work show up to set the record straight. Because in approximately 3 minutes, this carefully orchestrated celebration of traditional military values was about to meet the reality of modern warfare leadership. And the 3 people walking through those doors were going to have very strong opinions about anyone who'd falsify the record of an officer who'd kept them all safe. I checked my watch. 18:28 hours. The evening was about to take a very different direction than anyone in this room had expected. The main entrance doors opened at precisely 1830 hours, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. General Patricia Hawkins entered first, her 4 stars gleaming under the fluorescent lights, followed immediately by General Robert Chen, Joint Chiefs Cyber Warfare Advisor, and General Maria Santos, Supreme Allied Cyber Command. 3 of the most powerful figures in modern military leadership wearing dress uniforms that commanded instant recognition from anyone who understood what those stars represented. The effect was immediate and total. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, coffee cups froze halfway to lips. Every person in that room with military experience recognized the significance of what they were seeing. Flag officers didn't appear at retired colonels' birthday parties unless something extraordinary was happening. Dad was in the middle of telling a story about helicopter maintenance when the silence reached his table. He turned to see what had captured everyone's attention, and his face went through a series of expressions I'd never seen before. Confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been panic.
General Hawkins surveyed the room with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Then her gaze found me standing beside the memorial display.
She smiled, not the polite expression of someone fulfilling a social obligation, but the genuine warmth of recognition between colleagues. "Colonel Moore," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence. "Good to see you again." The sound that followed wasn't silence, it was the absence of breathing. 100 people simultaneously trying to process what they'd just heard. Colonel Moore. Not lieutenant, not the generic computer specialist, but Colonel Moore, addressed by a 4-star general with the respect reserved for senior officers. I straightened instinctively. "General Hawkins, I didn't expect you to make the trip personally." She approached with measured steps, her bearing commanding the kind of attention that made everyone else in the room fade into background. "When we learned about your family celebration, we felt it was important to pay our respects. Your service to this nation deserves recognition at the highest levels." General Chen stepped forward, extending his hand. "Colonel Moore, it's an honor. Your work on the European Joint Task Force has been briefed to the National Security Council 3 times this year. Exceptional leadership under the most challenging circumstances." General Santos joined them, creating a triangle of flag officers around me that transformed the entire dynamic of the room. "The Moscow incident alone should have earned you the Distinguished Service Medal," she said. "Preventing that coordinated attack saved thousands of lives and preserved critical alliance relationships." The Moscow incident. I watched Dad's face as he heard reference to something he'd never been told about, something that sounded nothing like the computer support work he'd been describing to his friends for years. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was standing near the head table, his eyes wide with the kind of recognition that comes from security clearances and classified briefings. "Jesus Christ," he whispered to no one in particular. "She's that Moore, the one from the NATO cyber defense protocols." Around the room, other pieces started falling into place. Chief Petty Officer Johnson was nodding slowly, understanding dawning on his face. Moore protocol. Holy shit, that's why the name was familiar. Colonel Martinez looked like someone had just explained a magic trick he'd been watching for years without understanding. The Joint Task Force commander who redesigned the entire European defense grid? Dad stood slowly, his face pale, looking between me and the 3 generals like he was trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit his understanding of the world. General Hawkins turned toward him with the courtesy due to a fellow officer, even a retired one. "You must be Colonel James Moore. Your daughter has brought tremendous honor to your family name. The strategic leadership she's demonstrated over the past 3 years has been nothing short of extraordinary." Dad's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Behind him, his friends were staring with expressions that ranged from shock to embarrassment as they realized how badly they'd misunderstood what they'd been dismissing as computer work. "When we learned she'd be attending your birthday celebration, we felt it was important to personally acknowledge her contributions. The work she's done protecting NATO networks has prevented what could have been catastrophic breaches of alliance security." General Santos gestured toward the memorial display. "We understand you've prepared an exhibit honoring family military service. We'd be honored to see it." The 3 of them moved toward the display with me, and I watched Dad's face as he realized they were about to examine the falsified documents he'd created. His color went from pale to gray. General Hawkins stopped in front of the altered Bronze Star citation, her expression shifting from polite interest to professional concern. She studied it for several seconds, then looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Colonel, this citation doesn't match the records we have on file. According to our documentation, your Bronze Star was awarded for command leadership during network defense operations, not technical support functions." The silence in the room was now complete and suffocating. Everyone understood they were witnessing something significant, even if they didn't understand all the technical details. General Chen examined the Onoga letter, frowning. "This document has been altered. Your official title was Primary Strategic Coordinator, not Administrative Liaison." General Santos picked up the commendation for the GPS defense operation. "Someone has systematically changed the language in these citations to misrepresent your role and responsibilities." I felt every eye in the room shift between me and Dad, who was standing frozen beside his birthday cake like a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. There seems to be some confusion about Colonel Moore's actual service record, General Hawkins said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that could end careers. She turned back to address the room. For those who may not be familiar with modern military operations, Colonel Moore has spent the past 3 years commanding cyber defense operations that protect every NATO installation from hostile digital attacks. She paused, letting that information settle. The defensive systems she designed and implemented have prevented 17 separate attempts to compromise critical military infrastructure. Her leadership during the coordinated attacks last spring saved thousands of military personnel from potential communications blackouts that could have resulted in catastrophic operational failures. General Chen stepped closer to Dad, his expression respectful but firm. "Colonel, your daughter isn't support staff. She's strategic command. The work she does determines whether our soldiers can communicate, navigate, and coordinate with allied forces during combat operations."
Dad finally found his voice, but it came out as barely a whisper. I didn't understand the technical aspects of her work. General Santos's expression softened slightly. "Many people don't understand cyber warfare, Colonel, but that doesn't diminish its critical importance to modern military operations. Your daughter has prevented digital Pearl Harbors that would have made conventional attacks look simple by comparison." Around the room, Dad's friends were staring at the 3 generals, then at me, then at the falsified display, beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd been witnessing for the past 2 hours. The room was about to learn exactly what happens when you underestimate the wrong person's military service. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before I made my choice. "Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like steel wire, "we need to talk about this display." Every person in that room understood they were about to witness something unprecedented. 3 4-star generals had just exposed falsified military documents at a retired colonel's birthday party, and his daughter, who wasn't the support staff they'd thought she was about to address the situation publicly. Dad looked like a man who'd been caught in a lie so comprehensive that he'd forgotten it was a lie. "Audrey, maybe we should discuss this privately." "No." The word came out sharper than I'd intended, but I was done protecting his comfort at the expense of my integrity. "We're going to discuss this right here, in front of everyone who's been listening to your version of my military service for the past 2 hours. I walked to the memorial display and picked up the altered Bronze Star citation. "This document says I received a Bronze Star for technical support functions. Would you like to tell everyone what really happened during that operation?" His face had gone from gray to ashen. "Sweetheart, I was just trying to make things easier for people to understand." "The truth?" I interrupted. "You were trying to make the truth easier to understand?" General Hawkins stepped closer, her presence lending weight to the moment. "Colonel Moore, why don't you tell everyone about that Bronze Star operation?" I held the falsified document up for the room to see. 6 months into my Afghanistan deployment, hostile forces launched a coordinated cyber attack against 3 forward operating bases simultaneously. They penetrated our communications networks, disabled GPS navigation systems, and attempted to take control of drone surveillance platforms. The room was absolutely silent. Even Dad's closest friends were leaning forward, understanding that they were hearing something that had never been shared before. For 14 hours, I commanded a joint response team of 37 specialists from 4 different countries. We worked without sleep, without breaks, while enemy forces used our communication blackout to advance on positions that had lost contact with command authority. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was nodding slowly, his security clearance allowing him to understand the implications better than most. Jesus Christ, that's the operation that saved Kandahar Airfield. I looked directly at Dad. We didn't just fix computer problems. We prevented 3 separate base overruns that would have resulted in hundreds of casualties.
The Bronze Star citation specifically mentioned my exceptional leadership under enemy fire and strategic decision-making that prevented catastrophic loss of life. Dad's mouth opened and closed without sound. I picked up the altered NATO appointment letter. This document says I was an administrative liaison for European computer systems. Would you like me to tell everyone what I actually did for NATO? General Chen stepped forward. Colonel Moore designed and implemented the integrated defense protocols that currently protect every major NATO installation from cyber warfare. She commanded a joint task force of over 200 personnel from 17 different countries. The Moscow incident alone involved preventing a coordinated attack that could have disabled communications for the entire European theater. Colonel Moore's leadership during that crisis earned her recognition from the National Security Council and personal commendation from the Secretary of Defense. I turned back to Dad, who was standing there looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. You turned designed and implemented integrated defense protocols into administrative liaison. You changed commanded joint task force into computer systems support. Around the room, his friends were staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment. These were military men who understood the difference between command authority and support functions, between strategic leadership and clerical work. And this, I said, holding up the GPS Defense Commendation, says I provided technical assistance with computer network maintenance. Want to know what really happened? Chief Petty Officer Johnson was shaking his head in disbelief. That's the GPS defense operation. It was classified, but we heard rumors. Someone prevented attack that would have blinded half our navigation systems. 3 hostile nations launched simultaneous attacks against GPS satellites and ground control systems. If they'd succeeded, every military operation in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa would have lost navigation capability simultaneously. General Hawkins' voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Colonel Moore's team identified the threat vectors, coordinated international response, and neutralized the attacks with 17 minutes to spare. 17 minutes between global navigation blackout and maintained operational capability. I looked around the room, making eye contact with the people who'd spent the evening treating me like support staff. For the past 2 hours, you've been politely asking about my computer work, while I've been protecting the systems that keep your bank accounts secure, your power grids operational, and your military sons and daughters alive in combat zones.
The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't confusion or uncertainty. This was the stunned recognition of people who'd completely misunderstood what they'd been witnessing. Dad, I said, turning back to face him directly, for 13 years, you've been telling people I was technical support. Every promotion, every deployment, every recognition, you found ways to minimize it because it didn't fit your understanding of what military service should look like. His voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. I thought I was protecting you from people who wouldn't understand. You were protecting yourself, I said, and the words hung in the air like an accusation. From having to admit that warfare had evolved beyond your experience, that your daughter was doing things you couldn't comprehend, leading operations you'd never heard of, preventing disasters you couldn't imagine. General Santos stepped closer to Dad, her expression respectful but firm. Colonel, your daughter has prevented more enemy victories than most combat officers see in entire careers. The fact that her battles are fought through fiber optic cables instead of rifle barrels doesn't make them less critical to national security. Around the room, I could see Dad's friends processing this information, understanding finally why their casual dismissal of my computer thing had been so fundamentally wrong. Derek was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Rachel had tears in her eyes. Mom looked proud and heartbroken simultaneously. I came here tonight hoping we could celebrate your service without diminishing mine, I said to Dad. But instead, I found falsified documents designed to erase everything I've accomplished. I gestured toward the 3 generals. These officers traveled across the country to honor your family, not because I asked them to, but because they understand that the daughter you've been hiding has spent her career keeping them all safe.
Dad finally found his voice, but it was shaky and uncertain. I never meant to dishonor your service. Then why did you rewrite it? Why turn 13 years of command responsibility into support functions? Why change operations commander into assigned to? Why present me to your entire community as someone I've never been? The questions hung in the air without answers because we both knew the truth. He'd rewritten my record because acknowledging what I really did would have forced him to admit that military leadership had evolved beyond his understanding, that his daughter had achieved things he couldn't categorize within his worldview. General Hawkins addressed the room one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, you've spent this evening in the presence of one of the most decorated cyber warfare officers in military history. Colonel Moore's service has protected not just American interests, but the entire Western Alliance's digital infrastructure. She turned to Dad. Colonel, your daughter has brought honor to your family name in ways you're only beginning to understand. And with that, the carefully constructed narrative that had shaped this entire evening, that had shaped years of family gatherings, collapsed completely. What happened next would determine whether we could build something honest from the wreckage, or whether this would be the last family celebration I ever attended. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.